My name is Patrick Donnelly, and I'm on a mission to build better leaders. On today's episode, I'm joined by a good friend and fellow leader developer named Jackson Kerchis. Jackson is co-founder of Happiness Means Business and Warrior Leader Training. More than that, he's a really likable and passionate guy, one of those rare people who's willing to pursue an objective wherever it leads. In his quest to shortcut his path to happiness, Jackson went all in, including a stint living as a Zen monk. What he found might surprise you, and his clients might surprise you even more. In today's conversation, listen for how important it is for a leader to create a proper work climate for his or her employees and the benefits that follow when employees' well-being, some might even dare say their happiness, is emphasized and intentionally fostered by the leader. So enough from me, let's get started with the Happiness Guru. Hey Jackson, thanks so much for joining us on Building Better Leaders.
My pleasure. Thank you, sir, for having me.
That's great. I mean, we've spoken many times, we've met in person, but the opportunity to actually do this in an official capacity where something's going to come out of it, it makes me happy.
Same here.
I mean, let's be honest, you're the happiness guru. And if I had the ability and I had unlimited money, I would have found a way to get Bobby McFerrin's Don't Worry, Be Happy as the intro for this podcast. And ever since we agreed to do the podcast, that song has been bouncing around in my head. So for the listeners that have never heard Bobby McFerrin's Don't Worry, Be Happy, trust me, listen to it once, you'll never forget it, and you might never get it out of your head.
Yeah, that might have to be my new theme song. Maybe you could write it off as like a charitable donation.
Great idea, business expense. See, this is why Jackson Kerchis is not only a happiness expert, but he's also an amazing entrepreneur. And you've got that in your background. That's part of who you are. You know, we kind of started tongue-in-cheek a little bit with the happiness thing, but I mean, that is a significant part of who you are and what you do. And I was just wondering if you could tell me a little bit about what you mean by that. I mean, it seems like everybody deep down wants to be happier. I don't know anybody, if you asked them the question, would say, no, I'm not really into happiness. But how do you take that and do something with it? What do you mean by the concept?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I would kind of give it a little bit of the personal side and then I guess theoretical, right? So to your point, that's kind of what started me on this journey. Years ago, I was at the University of Alabama. I was wanted to be like an investor, management consultant, CEO or something, and kind of thought, well, why do I want to make a bunch of money and be rich and be famous or successful or whatever? And I was like, well, ultimately I just want to be happy. And so being sort of a lazy college kid, I was like, well, what if I just skip over becoming like a super rich, successful investor and just study the happiness part? It sounds a bit easier. And so, that led me to doing research, creating a major, living as a monk. And I can share more about all that story. But yeah, it really comes down to that essential question of, I sometimes challenge people to go through what I call like the 3 levels of why. And that's basically saying, okay, what do you want out of life? And whatever you answer initially, well, why do you want that? And then why do you want that? And why do you want that? And usually, you can imagine, well, I want to get promoted to a 2-star general. Well, why do you want that? Well, because I want to have an impact and serve my country. Well, why do you want that? Well, because that would make me feel a sense of pride and contentment. And if you have pride and contentment, what do you have? Happiness, right? So that's sort of how I think about it. But to your point about what it is, I like to be sure that I don't confuse it with kind of toxic positivity, like sunshine, rainbows, and joy. The construct that I've started to think about that's kind of grounded in a few different psychological models is I say, look, you can think of it across time, right? Not to get too, metaphysical, but past, present, and future. Okay. So if you're happy with the past, that's sort of like life satisfaction and contentment. That typically comes about through a sense of meaning, purpose, and achievement, right? So you're kind of looking back on your life and saying, yeah, this makes sense and I'm happy with it. You have happiness, let's call it, with the future, which is sort of optimism, hopefulness. I think my life's going to be good. And then in the present moment, you have really any sort of positive emotion. I think Barbara Fredrickson is a psychology researcher who says there's like 10 of them, but that could be anything from interest to amusement to awe to joy to gratitude. And so, right, you can think about, generally speaking, if you're happy with your life, you feel happy about your future, kind of optimistic, and in your day-to-day, you have minimal negative experiences and more of a balance of positive, then you're sort of happy with a capital H, I call it. And of course, you're going to have bad days or bad weeks, or you lose a loved one and you're sad for months. Like, that's all part of the spectrum of just being a human. Okay, but generally, when we're doing well in all those areas, that's what happiness means to me.
Okay, so that's helpful, but I still am not exactly sure. What do you do with that? Like, I agree that is a place that we're all seeking to be. You have taken this concept and this, I think, important pursuit, and you've found a way to actually find the value that goes beyond just the individual and are looking at how does happiness actually help a workplace or a business or a military, et cetera. And I'm interested in how you take this idea, this concept of individual happiness, and blend it into something that there is, I don't know, for lack of a better word, there's a competitive advantage in an entity, an organization, even a person, in maximizing that in its people.
Yeah, so the business connection sort of came about by accident for us. And it really started, I should say for me, in that I read, it all started, there's a paper's a meta study. Okay, so that's a study of studies. It's called The Frequent Benefits of Positive Emotion. Does happiness lead to success? Or something like, I might have a word off. But basically, these three researchers, Leiber, Mirsky, King, and Diener, looked at all these different studies, and they started to find, right, we tend to think the model we're all given, that's kind of how we parent, it's how we manage, it's how we plan our careers, is I'm going to work harder and achieve more and be more successful, and then I'll get more happiness. It doesn't always work. I know a lot of rich, miserable people out there. And what they started to look at is not that achievement's bad, right? Getting some success does usually make us happier. But what they found in all this research was happiness actually leads to more success. And so you have examples in salespeople who are more optimistic, selling, I think it was like 30% more than their less happy peers. You have people who tend to experience more positive emotion, being more engaged at work and even more creative and better at solving problems. So relationships, some of these personal success domains, even like income, what these researchers found is like, hey, it actually seems like people who are happier end up being more successful, not the relation we usually think of as success leading to happiness. And then when we look at organizations, right, not just the individuals within the organizations, but the organizations themselves, we see a similar trend. I saw there's a really interesting, it's an index fund called HAPI, HAPI, developed by Irrational Capital. This is just one example, but they invest in companies with higher benchmarks of employee well-being. That index fund has outperformed the market the last several years. You can look at even studies from Gallup, right? So their term is employee engagement, which is not quite the same thing as employee happiness, but you can imagine how that's pretty related, right? It's a measure of like interest, satisfaction, enthusiasm with your work. And, you have all sorts of incredible outcomes where companies that have higher employee engagement have better quality outcomes, fewer defects, better safety outcomes. Obviously, their retention's much better. Their stock performance is better, earnings per share. And so we started to see, and again, it's somewhat intuitive in a sense too, that like if people are happier at work, you tend to get more out of them. They show up at their best. And then there is and I'm sure you'll want to talk about it a little bit, but there's some interesting connections to that same research that we found in the military as well.
Interesting. So that study that you were just referencing in the maybe the intuition that goes with that, as you were in your formative stage of putting these things together for yourself, and you had mentioned earlier that you had some interesting experience as a monk, or at least living with monks. How would you categorize yourself during that period?
Yeah, so I spent 4 months, living with Zen monks, and I've had some back and forth debate. Like, I don't really know, like, because I'll say like, I was a Zen monk, and I'm like, I don't know, I didn't live for 10 years in the mountains of Nepal, but I sometimes joke, I'm like, I spent a summer as a fry cook, and when I say, I was a fry cook, no one questions that. But I spent 4 months living as a Zen monk, and it's like, well, are you a monk or are you not? So in any case, spent 4 months studying there.
Were you in Nepal?
No, this was actually in San Francisco Zen Center, which was like basically the first Zen temple founded in the US in the 60s. And so really that time there, a really interesting field to me is it's called contemplative science, a relatively new field. And it's looking at basically the intersection of ancient, spiritual, contemplative, religious practices and modern science, often neuroscience. And really what we're seeing is these contemplative practices like meditation, like prayer, whatever your tradition is. I'm not here to tell you anything about what religious practice to follow, but that there's a lot of wisdom coming out of these traditions, particularly when it comes to transforming your mind, really, intentionally. And so that's, to me, where that kind of Zen and Buddhist perspective has influenced me. Is their sort of model is, if you practice cultivating awareness through meditation and sort of thing, that you start to see yourself and your life differently, and you develop a tendency to be more present in a given moment. And that helps you be more patient, potentially more kind, maybe a bit more insightful in your reactions to things. And so really it's saying that through the intentional practices, you can change your way of being. And then we look over at modern science with neuroplasticity, which is all about how the brain changes based on how it's used. And so it's really kind of shifted my perspective on, let's call it happiness, quality of life, of course, leadership as well. This, that if you engage in intentional behaviors, habits, and practices, you can fundamentally transform how you show up as a leader, as a parent, as a friend, and as in any area of life. And so, of course, I think that perspective is really important to have when you're thinking about growing as a person and your happiness as well as a leader.
Just to pull on that string a little bit, it sounds like what you're saying is that happiness isn't dependent on external circumstances, but that as a person with agency, I have the ability to intentionally think in ways that basically build the pathways in my mind that then allow me to be happier regardless of circumstances. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. The only thing I'd add is I don't want to overlook the role of circumstances, right?
Yeah.
I think to me it's like nature versus nurture, right? It's clearly both. If you're in a situation where you're in extreme poverty or a war zone, or you're having a traumatic experiences happen to you, those outside circumstances are going to have their effect. And we also know in the psychology research, this comes out largely of research done in twin studies, which are kind of interesting. You have twins that are separated at birth, and researchers track them down and compare them and look at their lives. That roughly maybe even up to 50% of your happiness, largely speaking, is genetic. But so then it comes down to, okay, there's another 50% on the pie chart. And then there are these external circumstances, some of which you can control, but the beauty of life is not all of it's up to your control. So there's still a pretty big piece of the pie chart where, absolutely, to your point, I sometimes call it the learned happiness model. But it's, essentially that if you understand certain kind of ingredients, certain causes, conditions, and skills of happiness, right? And then you put those into practice, you will ultimately learn to be happier and change your brain accordingly. And so, a really simple example of this would be gratitude practices are a pretty well-researched intervention. And so we say, okay, I'm going to intentionally evoke a state of gratitude once a week or once a day, just listing a few things I'm thankful for. And so you do that for several weeks, and then researchers show that it's not true for everyone, but on average, you end up being happier, right? Because you've sort of engaged those neural pathways, biasing yourself to look for more of what's going well. So that's kind of a small example of what I say is the broader phenomenon.
Really interesting. So I can see how this makes a lot of sense for an individual. And I know you go around and you do lectures and workshops and you're engaged in a number of different events where you're communicating these principles to people. And I can see how, as if I was an individual in your audience, that these things gives me a sense of I have a role to play in my own happiness. There are things I should be doing, or I have the power to control in my own life with regards to happiness. But what I think is really interesting, and just doing some research on some of the things that you've been doing, you're a co-founder of an enterprise, Happiness Means Business. As you mentioned earlier, you're working with the military in a number of different ways with your warrior leader training system, and on and on. I mean, anybody who hasn't heard of Jackson Kerchis should do a search and look at some of the stuff that's out there, because really fascinating guy. How do you take those things from really sort of an emphasis on me as an individual and things that I can do to better control my own outlook, and then move to a different level of, let's say, me as a supervisor or a manager or a leader? What is my role in helping to create happiness with those who work with me?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So, I think leaders play really a key role in that. We always say, especially when we work with military guys, and a lot of people, especially anywhere in the military, have encountered mental health issues and maybe even suicides. And so we always like to emphasize, you're never responsible, I wouldn't say, for someone else's happiness. But what you can think about is creating, to the extent possible, in your approach to leadership, causes and conditions where people can flourish. It even kind of ties into command climate, which, I know historically, at least from what we hear, there's different sides of that sometimes command climate feels like just a check the box, like, oh, we do the deox and it's whatever. But there's really some great guidance in there around, if you think about the climate, right? So let's think about that in the form of an analogy. Right, the climate in your farm or forest or garden, right? That's sort of the causes and conditions, and how well things are going to grow or flourish there is based on the climate. And so same thing in terms of your leadership climate. How can you sort of try to set people up to do quite well? And so we can, of course, go more in depth, but some of the key things I like to think about there, one of the things, a very useful model is self-determination theory. Very well researched, and it basically is one of the ways to explain people's kind of happiness at work, satisfaction, engagement, etc. It says that we all have needs for competence, autonomy, and relatedness, which is kind of like social connection. I think another big one in the military struggles with a lot, at least in our work with the National Guard, is work-life balance. So let's just say you got 4 things right there. So you as a leader can think about, hey, how can I help my people feel more of a sense of competence? Now that construct of competence means that people feel valued, they feel witnessed for their contribution, and importantly, they feel like they're growing and developing. So could be something as simple as saying, each month in a counseling, we're going to make a done list together of all of the things you've accomplished the last month. And then I want to ask you what you would like to see out of your development and growth in this organization. And I'm going to support you in our next month's counseling to make progress on that. Boom. You just help them with confidence. Relatedness. Okay, I'm going to do once a quarter MWR event. We're going to do a facilitated conversation, and then we're going to go do a group activity. It's going to help people kind of build genuine friendships at work, which is an important part of engagement. And then autonomy, right? That's giving people more of a sense of ownership and control over their work. So you're going to say, hey, this is a crazy idea, but okay, actually for leadership, this is interesting. Google in some of their divisions does something called 20% time. Say once a week, you're just going to work on whatever you want. And that's led to inventions like Google AdSense and Google News, which are probably multi-billion-dollar enterprises. Now, maybe in the military, it's harder to do something like that, but maybe you say, hey, once a month, I want you to take a half day and work on a work project that's not your job, but it's something that you felt like you've wanted to work on. Or, hey, right, mission command. We're going to get after this project here, but I don't want to micromanage you. I want you to take ownership with some left-right boundaries and command intent. Let's get after it. And then finally, work-life balance. You can imagine, right, building out some policies or solutions there, making sure people aren't overworked. And so I know this was a long-winded answer, right? But what you just did there is we took this sort of ambiguous concept of happiness and leadership, deconstruct that into a few components: competence, autonomy, relatedness, and work-life balance, and just give you some leadership interventions that you can do. And if you get after those kind of factors, it's likely that people are going to feel happier and perform better.
I really like that. And, you and I have spoken about the leadership framework that we teach at the Do the Leadership Center, Lead, Develop, Care. And I see a lot of connections with the concepts you just talked about and the concepts that we teach, the framework that we teach. And I think I don't doubt that what you're doing works, because I've seen what we're doing, how much it works. And I think the two things that I love hearing you focus on, and that I don't think we could emphasize enough to our audience, is the importance of being intentional. These things don't happen by accident. We're all busy. It's just so much easier to make assumptions, just assume that I'm doing these things, or assume that my people feel good and valued and feel like they're growing and contributing. And the second one is, in addition to being intentional, is being individual. To begin thinking beyond the unit or the organization and thinking about the individual people that I'm responsible for. And I love the way that you are really intent on giving people practical things that they can do to be more effective in generating this sense of well-being, or this sense of happiness, and therefore the positive result that comes from that in the workplace. When you were talking about relatedness, I just was curious, given we've had this crazy COVID experience that really shifted the work climate and employees' perception of what is the norm, that perhaps working from home is now the norm. And look, we did this for a couple of years and look how well it worked. And now there tends to be, at least among some organizations, this desire to pull people back into the office, and there's a great deal of resistance. I'm curious, in that realm of relatedness, do you see that this idea of everybody working from home actually works against that? Or is there a way to both meet what the employee thinks he or she wants and this concept of related, still bring those two things together?
Yeah. Well, and I think if you rewind to the model I just shared, self-determination theory, I think that illustrates why this is such a tension or potential conflict or difficult issues, because we just said the two biggest constructs, or two of the three, are relatedness, which is that social connection, and autonomy, which is, right, that freedom and flexibility and ownership over your work. And the whole work from home debate to me is just, you're putting those two things almost together, and there's going to be trade-offs for each. I think if you're in person every single day in a lot of contexts, you're probably going to get closer to the people you work with, but you've just lost all of that autonomy and flexibility. And then, right, other extreme, fully remote is great. When I started my career in management, one of my roles was I'd moved out of the warehouse into customer service and I was full-time remote, and it was amazing. But yeah, naturally, I wasn't quite as connected with my coworkers. So I think it really comes down to just the context of your organization, probably avoiding either extreme. Obviously some roles it's going to depend. You can't, my uncle he was a Air Force reservist, but full-time fixing AC-130s. Can't fix AC-130s from Zoom. Say, oh yeah, we just move that thing over there, right? So I'd say generally, I don't think most workplaces should be all in, full-time in the office 5 days a week, no matter what, because you're losing some flexibility, right? Even, in that example, there's probably, if you needed to, hey, I've got a family event, could I telework one day? Like, okay, you're going to catch up on some trainings or something you have to do, right? But then I also might avoid the other extreme in a lot of cases of full remote, because you do lose out on that social connection. So I think some hybrid, right, on that spectrum probably makes sense to balance those two needs for relatedness and competence. And the only thing I'll add is if you do ask people to come in, just for goodness sakes, give them an actual reason and make it worthwhile. I remember, again, when I was in that management role, my remote customer service team, their job was data entry. And so you can imagine they're sitting at home on their computers, entering data into the system super intensely because it was a very high performance environment. Or they're coming into the office, they don't have time to socialize, so they're just entering data into a computer at the office. And usually on those in-person days, we would do one 40-minute PowerPoint that was just like some sort of review that was meant to be like a team building thing. And even when we were in the office, oftentimes we would meet on Zoom because it was easier to just share screen. And so you get a lot of people being like, you're asking me to come in, but why? So that's the only thing I'd add to that is if you are bringing people in, be intentional about facilitating some of that development, collaboration, and connection.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think sometimes we make the decision because the decision sounds right, but we don't actually think through, how do I make this valuable for the person? Mm-hmm. Not just I'm doing it because, but there is a purpose in why I'm doing this, and I will intentionally, there's that word again, make this a valuable process that's worth the effort of coming into the office. I can see how a lot of these terms make sense when it comes to a workplace in which people can quit. I'm here by choice. I can quit at any point. I can go find somewhere else that I like better. In the military, it's a very different demographic. Obviously, you sign a contract. You are basically committing yourself to do whatever the military needs you to do 24/7. I mean, you are signing up to be at the mercy of the military's needs. And there's not the ability for an employee just to say, you know what, I don't like this anymore. I'm going to go find something else. How do you know in your time working with the military, what have you seen within the military that gives you a sense that, hey, this works in the military in that sort of a different environment, the same as it does in the civilian realm?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. So maybe I'll start with one just research and then one case study. So on the research side, one that I just think is interesting, just thinking about the role of how this connects to military readiness and performance. There was a paper published in, I think it was 2021, called Happy Soldiers Are Highest Performers. And what they're looking at here is basically how your happiness or well-being, which they really look at as positive emotional affect, right? You generally are more positive, and positive outlook. So they kind of combine those two things. So they wanted to look at that. And then over a 4-year follow-up window, how many soldiers, this was in the Army, so how many soldiers won an award and what that relationship looked like, if your sort of happiness and well-being predicted anything about your performance level. And so these were awards for both performance and for heroism, actually, I should add, which is kind of interesting. And so they looked at, I think it was, I have the paper pulled up, 908,096 Army soldiers, all, both genders, demographics, backgrounds, everything. And what they find is that, as the title of the paper basically says, happy soldiers are highest performers, right? The happier you are, that combination of positive outlook and positive affect, the more likely you are to win an award over the next few years. And I'm just comparing the soldiers with the highest versus the lowest, predicted almost a 4 times greater likelihood of winning an award. So you can imagine these really, and I don't want to be critical of them. In a lot of cases, it's probably not their fault. But, these soldiers who are really kind of miserable versus their counterparts who are really flourishing, 400% difference in likelihood of winning an award for performance, right? That's right there. You just start to get the business case of this kind of matters, not just for civilian workforces, but in the military as well. Now, looking at a case study that we helped facilitate of a battalion in the Army National Guard, they were, I think, a really good example of this. So this was a recruiting and retention battalion. And so they were, I think, number 50 or something in the country. You're really struggling in a lot of ways in a state with a very low propensity to serve. So we worked with their new leadership team. This was back in, I think, like 2022, 2023. And they said, hey, our top priority is we want to get the command climate right. We're really running with this happiness stuff. How do we create a climate where people flourish? And so, they did everything from looking at some organizational things like their NCOIC to recruiter ratio. Okay, so do we have time to actually, to your point about the intentional and the one-to-one, do we have time to actually develop these people so they are bringing their best at work? They also looked at just their command philosophy, trying to build trust, doing some of the trainings we do around the constructs I shared earlier. And so long story short, what we see is, okay, first, we can look at their command climate data. And we see huge improvements in reducing risk factors and increasing protective factors. So, things like high morale, work-life balance. We are a cohesive organization. We have supportive leadership. Those things are going up on the area of 10%. Some of the risk factors like sexually harassing behaviors, workplace hostility, those are plummeting to, by 20%, right? Which is good in this case because they're risk factors. And then what we see is over the course of the next mission year, about a 34% improvement in recruiting production, despite turning over almost half of I think it was their retention workforce too. They met their missions there. And so they met all of their state missions for the first time in, I think, 6 years. And so the nice thing about a recruiting and retention battalion is maybe that the sort of metrics of success are a bit more tangible, right? Like we know it's all about recruiting, retention, production. But I think this applies, right? It's indicative of what can happen in any unit or any battalion, or even I think we trained one fighter wing out there, that when you get that climate right of focusing on developing people, trying to create a climate where they really flourish, then those lagging metrics often are going to pick up.
So what would you say then, and that's a great answer, and I love the study because I think it, like you said earlier, it's almost intuitive that as people feel better about where they work, feel better about the environment in which they work, they're more likely to bring their best to that situation. But in my experience going around training, I find that there's often, at least initially, a skepticism that says, hey, look, you're not paying me to make people happy, you're paying me to get a mission done. Or on the other hand, they might say, this all sounds way too touchy-feely for me. I'm not a crier, I'm not a hugger, I'm not gonna hold your hand. That's not what you're paying me to do. I don't think that's what you're talking about, but how do you respond if you hear those sorts of sentiments?
Yeah. No, we've definitely run into that. We did our first training. So we did sessions there were both sailors and Marines, but Marine Corps drill instructors, which, you can imagine they're, amongst the sort of toughest of the tough in the military. And, I think what exemplifies it well was we had this experience with I think he was a CSM enlisted in the Army National Guard. And, he kind of came up to us after the one training, had a big dip in, like Carhartt shirt, jeans, work boots. And he's like, I thought this was going to be some woke bullshit, but, you guys were pretty good. And so, usually when I address the kind of skeptics in the room, I say, like, look, you don't have to call it happiness. You can call it whatever you want. And we're not saying that negative emotions are always bad either. So one of my favorite leaders is, I think he's still a brigadier general. He might be major general now, but he just took over as the adjutant general of the Wisconsin National Guard, Matt Strub. And, he always say, top priority, we're going to treat everyone with dignity and respect. I don't care if you're giving them a medal or you're kicking them out of the Army for sexual misconduct. We're going to treat them with dignity and respect. But when we think about the role of emotions, right, we're not saying that you always need to be touchy-feely or that you should always lean into positive emotions, right? Because it's that example. If someone is violating, doing something unethical, sexual misconduct, or even, right, they're downrange when their rounds going downrange and they shouldn't be, that may be a case where anger is a very appropriate and skillful reaction. And so what we're really advocating here is, at least on the kind of emotional, touchy-feely, quote unquote side, is, we call it emotional intelligence, right? I'm sure you touch on that in some of your training. It's the ability to be aware of your emotional state and the emotional states of others, and then skillfully manage those to create a context where you're getting the results you want. So, like I said, right, it's not all touchy-feely happiness. You can call it whatever you want. At the end of the day, we're really teaching you how to use emotions intelligently in your leadership style, and then deploy some proven tools that are going to help people to be at their best more consistently.
So if you were helping a leader begin to implement some of these things, and you knew they were in the type of organization where they were going to get a lot of pushback, a lot of skepticism from some of the key subordinate leaders on their team, what would be some ways that you might share with them of how to disarm that or to make it more palatable for them to begin to consider?
Yeah. Well, something, and we've even learned this in our business, is like, you don't have to call it happiness, right? Like, we talked a lot about that because that's sort of my background and research. But, I say a lot of it I think about is, and we've started doing this, is tying it into two things, right? So one is known problems and capability gaps, and the other is command climate, right? That's the beautiful thing is, like, we tend to think, like, often I think, oh, the military, when it comes to culture, maybe they're a little behind or they have their issues, or, oh, well, they're not big on supporting mental health or whatever, right? Those are obviously negative stereotypes. I don't think they're true most of the time, but it's like, you guys actually invented command climate. Like, the DOD, and I think it's the Department of Analytics or something, established this construct, and it's like really freaking good when you look at the research into it. And so so to your point, I would say, number one, right, tying it to that, you don't have to come in and say, hey, we're doing a happiness session, right? You might say, hey, we're going to work on cohesion and connectedness. I'm just reading some of the DEOX factors right now. We're going to talk about supportive leadership. Hey, we're going to talk about the morale of our organization, right? So you're tying it to constructs that already exist. And then the second piece I said is, tying it to already known issues, because we already know, for the most part across the forces, recruiting and retention have been challenges, at least, in the last few years. And in a lot of cases, there are exceptions. But so it's like, hey, how do we create a culture that actually attracts people and that people want to stay? Or we see there's issues with, let's say, productivity. okay, well, how can we help people to be more energized and positive when they're dealing with really stressful work? So to answer your question, that would be my start point is, look for known problem sets that kind of relate to this, and then just tie it into command climate because, right, that construct already exists in this ecosystem.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to do it. It sometimes a word can be something that can be a stumbling block. And it really goes back to being intentional again. What is it that I'm trying to achieve as a leader, and how best can I achieve that? And that includes, what words do I use? How do I communicate this thing to this particular person as opposed to, the person in the office next door? Each of those people may need to hear a slightly different way of framing that in order to disarm that and begin to make progress on it. So I'm interested in touching a little more on this idea of creating a content or happy workplace with the role of discipline and accountability. Because again, sometimes as I am talking with people about what we do, I'll get back from them either, hey, look, when people are doing something wrong, there needs to be discipline, there needs to be accountability. Or what I see more often than that is not, and maybe this is a societal stereotype, that the military is all about discipline and accountability. It's all hard-nosed. In reality, what I find is, as I go around training people in our lead develop care workshops, is that supervisors and leaders, especially younger supervisors and leaders, or more inexperienced supervisors and leaders, have a very difficult time moving from, I'm providing you with the care and the compassion, but I have a very difficult time of knowing when is the appropriate time to shift into more accountability and discipline. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, so my initial reaction, is like, of course, these two things are by no means like incompatible, right? And so a couple initial thoughts, right? One, I think context is really important. We always, and I'm sure you think about that, like kind of situational leadership. We sometimes have a running joke when we're training, like when we were training the Marines, is like, okay, so let's say we know that there's something called psychological safety, which kind of gets back to relatedness, but it's basically you operate in an environment of trust where you feel an environment safe for asking questions, taking risk, trying things and failing, etc. And so one of the ways you can do that as a leader is to, kind of frame your conversations like, hey guys, we're getting after this new project or whatever. I wanted to get your feedback. I want to get your input. Here are some of my thoughts, but I'd like to invite in your contribution. Okay. And you're maybe circled up for that. Now, if you're in Afghanistan and you're about to kick down a door in hostile territory, you don't need to say, hey guys, I just wanted to check in, kind of how are we feeling about this? Did you want to go first? Right? So situation matters, right? So I think same thing, right? If you're doing a National Guard M-Day monthly drill weekend training with a captain, it's his 2 months in and he doesn't have his shirt on right. Okay. That's going to be a little bit more, hey, let's correct that. Not a big deal. Whereas if you have an ethical or safety standard, that's where we need some pretty intense discipline. So context matters. And we also emphasize though that, again, it needs to be progressive. I think if you go to this knife hand every single time, or they say, some of the guys we've trained to say like, if you're always at a level 10, then pretty soon people just, when it's an actual emergency or an actual mission critical error, people are kind of like, well, is this even, this is just their usual thing. So I would say progression is important. Kind of situational context is important for the discipline and accountability. And then the third thing I'd say is you can implement all this same stuff and still keep your same accountability and like talent management standards, right? Like all it is in that same counseling, let's say, which you do every month or every so often, right? Same accountability, same discipline standards, but then you just add in 1 or 2 items where you check in with them on, hey, how are you feeling, mentally and emotionally right now in terms of your satisfaction at work? And remember, thinking back to some of those constructs I picked earlier, hey, how are you feeling about work-life balance? Is there anything I could give you or take away, or maybe things we could do better as a unit that would help you feel a bit more harmony? So again, the discipline and accountability are just still there, but you've just added in kind of one other thread to your leadership.
Yeah, I like that. I have this sense, and I'm curious as to what you think, but I have always felt best in an organization where I knew what the right and left limits were, and I trusted that if those are the right and left limits, that they were going to be enforced fairly. In other words, if this is the rule set, and I understand the rule set, and everybody's playing by this rule set, my expectation is that if somebody steps outside the rule set, there is going to be corrective action that brings them back in. Yeah. And I believe that as human beings, we often naturally, at least initially, we kind of push against the boundaries. Yeah. We don't like to be constrained. But at the point where everybody senses that, no, these are the boundaries and they will be fairly enforced, then harmony begins to permeate through the unit because everybody understands, oh, okay, I got it. We're all playing by the same set of rules. And it's the exception when somebody violates the rule set and nothing happens that creates disharmony. What do you think about that?
I totally agree. And I mean, I'm just looking again because I'm working on our next book, which is on command climate. And right there, number 4 on one of the protective factors is exactly that, fairness. Because, to your point, and again, this goes obviously just beyond the military, but anytime there's sort of a rules for thee and not for me situation, which, we see a lot in politics, not to go there, but on all sides. So I think that's why there's so much frustration with that. But yeah, people's natural reaction is like, what the heck, dude? Like, what is this?
Yeah. So I think discipline and accountability have a positive effect on the unit as a whole because everybody now understands this. Everybody is held to the same standard. But I also think discipline and accountability have a very positive individual benefit as well. Because if you think about, disciplining your child, why do you discipline your child? It isn't because you don't like them. It isn't because you just are angry that they did something wrong. Generally, we discipline our children because we want to make them more productive adult human beings. We want to make them more successful in their future. And I think if we don't care about somebody enough to step in and provide them the discipline and the accountability that their actions deserve, what we're actually doing is we're allowing them to keep potentially taking a step further and further to the point that eventually they get to the point where we cannot pull them back. We can't rehabilitate them, or they've done something so egregious now that they have to go do something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And it even reminds me of kind of, again, getting like really actionable here with things to do. The part of that case study I shared earlier with the RRB in Wisconsin, they reevaluated kind of their performance policy. And one of the main things they tried to do was make it way more transparent. So it's the same for everyone, right? Getting at that fairness piece. And it was, basically like we have published standards. They're the same for everyone or, within reason, right? Depending on what your role is and your mission assignment, whatever, but they're kind of standardized, transparent. You're getting that left-right boundaries, expectations shared with you from the moment you're brought into that battalion. And then this idea of the discipline, I think there's an association in our mind that discipline always means like, hey, you did something wrong. In their case, what they did is if you were not meeting the standard, those first few counselings, right, it was progressive. So the first conversation, and still discipline, but it's saying like, hey, you're not on track to meet your mission here. What's going on? What do you think's behind that? Is everything okay? How can we better support you? Right. And then maybe the next couple conversations are still kind of that coaching mentality of, well, what does your weekly inputs look like? What are your priorities? What are you doing? Let me shadow you on one of these recruiting conversations, right? And then if it continues, that's where it gets to be more like, hey, maybe you won't be eligible for this education thing or for this benefit or this whatever. And importantly, I thought this was interesting too. If you were really just maybe a good soldier, but you didn't have what it takes to be a recruiter, or you didn't have the retention skill set, like they would place you somewhere else in the organization, right? So you can think about the same thing in any unit, right? Maybe you don't have the skills, but you're genuinely trying and you're a good team member, right? And so I liked how they had that approach to discipline, right? That you still need the discipline and accountability, but discipline doesn't always have to be straight to the kind of you messed up. It can be transparent, consultative, and then it progresses as you go.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. It still, I've seen it over and over again, even when you're looking at it as, hey, can you think of this as more corrective, or can you think of this as more rehabilitative, or even as more caring? And even when you take the slow, progressive approach, there are still people who feel like when I am having that conversation, I'm becoming the bad guy, or I'm mean, is the word that they'll use. Like, I feel mean when I do that. Do you have any practical helps for people who might be struggling with that? Is there anything that, I know it's a bit outside kind of the norm, but when you're thinking about mentoring a young leader, what advice would you give somebody to help them move through that discomfort and be more comfortable with, even at that low end of the discipline scale?
Yeah. Yeah. Two thoughts. I mean, the first is, I always say, like, when you're in doubt, you can always just ask them, right? So, you can imagine if you and I were kind of having a conversation like this and say, hey, here's why I'm trying to coach you on this, or counsel you on this, or help you with this, however you want to frame it. You talk through it a little bit and you say, like, hey, let me just check in right now. Like, are we good? Or do you feel this is the right amount of intensity or whatever? And, probably the person's going to tell you, like, 90% of the time, like, yeah, I get you're just doing your job. Like, right, your job is to lead and manage me, like, right? Unless you're coming in there shouting and knife hand. Like, I think a lot of times, like you said, as a leader, you feel like I'm being mean or I'm being something, whereas the person that you're working with often maybe doesn't see it that way. So one is to just check in with them and just ask them. And then the second one, I don't know if I'm going to get it exactly right, but I remember seeing it from the organizational psychologist Adam Grant. And he said something like, these 19 words will help you to get more responsiveness, engagement, and deliver better feedback. And so maybe you can keep a tally if I get the 19 right, but it was, I'm giving this feedback to you because I have high standards for you and I'm confident you can meet them. Boom. Just start the conversation with that, right? So, okay, if you're worried about being mean, that's how I might start it.
Yeah. I mean, even if you don't say those exact words, even like you said earlier, by being intentional and really thinking through, what is it that I'm trying to get out of this engagement that I'm about to have? And just telling yourself, this is my motivation, this is why I'm having this conversation, might really help free you up. That's it. I didn't count 19, but it sounded really good, however many words that were there. Yeah, I just find that out of all of the different concepts that we teach, the concept of leading somebody, the necessity of developing them, and then that the aspect of care, the issue that all of those things make sense. I think people feel like, okay, yep, I understand those things. But this aspect of discipline, when do I move from this caring approach to, no, now my care is going to shift. I care about you enough to correct bad behavior that's going to lead to bad result or suboptimal performance. That's a really tough thing, and I think a lot of people are struggling with that. And I do believe that, as you said earlier, the more we can do that consistently, the greater the sense of belonging there is in the unit, that these people care enough about me and what we're producing that this is a place I find valuable to be. I feel myself becoming better than I was before. So you mentioned this book that you're working on, and I know you've written a couple of books. Tell me a little bit about the book that you're working on now.
Yeah, hopefully it's out in a few months, but I feel like there's some sort of law in project management, I think, that's like the final 10% of the project will take as long as the first 90%. So that's definitely how it is with writing books. But yeah, the intention with this one, not sure what brilliantly, I don't know what the title is going to be yet, but really it's just trying to be a very practical handbook for command climate. And because what we've just heard and working with some of the different branches is like the DOX is pretty established, and there's usually guidance around every time there's a change of command, and then once a year we're going to implement the DOX, and then we kind of do it's not an AAR, but we're going to look at the results and think about it. But I just wanted to write like just a really short book for, hey, just you as a leader, what actually is this thing? So very briefly, what are the kind of major risk factors? I think there's like 9 of them. And then what are the major protective factors? And then just very briefly, what are some kind of practical tools or models or approaches you can use to try to support those in your leadership style?
That sounds fascinating. I think many leaders out there they go through training, you go through years of training perhaps, and you get a lot of concepts, you get a lot of tools, but in the sense of, yeah, but what do I use practically? Like practically, what does this mean for me? People are hungry for that. And it sounds like that's what you're trying to produce.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. So Jackson, tell me if people want to understand more about who you are and what you're doing, where can they follow you? Where can they find more information about you?
Yeah, absolutely. So anything on the military side is going to be warriorleadertraining.com. So you can get our brochure, you can read or watch videos of soldiers and airmen and Marines and maybe sailors talking about the impact it's had. And, really what we do there can be big, can be small, but anything kind of leadership development side for the armed forces. And we're actually piloting our first law enforcement and public service training as well this fall. So for those listeners there, and then anything more on the kind of keynote speaking for businesses, associations, corporate side, happinessmeansbusiness.com. We've got free tools and resources there as well that you can check out. And we send out a newsletter we call it, I think, 3-Minute Thursday. So it's very brief, but we send that out every other Thursday. So if you want the research, tips, any of the models I shared today find interesting, that's a good way to get a quick read every couple weeks in your inbox.
I love it. So when your book comes out, will you be advertising that on the Warrior Leader website? Is that where they can go to find where that is?
Yes. Hopefully it's out here relatively soon. I think it will be by the end of the year. And yeah, warriorleadertraining.com, we'll have it listed there. And anything else for me, I'm pretty findable on Google. If you just type in my name, Jackson Kerchis, you should be able to track it down. But yeah, that's where to go for the book.
And will that book be equally applicable across the services?
Yeah, our intention is it's going to be kind of for that maybe slightly more senior leadership level. But yeah, whether you're Navy, Marines, Air Force, Army, National Guard, of course, we've at least talked to, in some small capacity, I think every single one of those groups now. So I think it'll apply.
Yeah, great. Just even on the civilian side, if I could just give a personal example, I've been in an organization that, as the senior leader changed out, basically there's the equivalent of a DOX or a climate survey that people make a lot of money conducting on behalf of organizations. Where are we as a team, as a business, as an organization? Several of the results that I've seen that came out of that on the civilian side have still remained very vague, in the sense of, okay, you've identified for me some issues. I'm not exactly sure what to do about those issues. So it sounds like this resource that you're creating, really with the kind of military in mind, would also potentially be very helpful for leaders of civilian organizations and teams as well. Is that true?
Yeah, and I mean that's really all we do at our on our happiness means business side, is taking it to corporations, businesses, even public sector, non-military we've done for I think the Canadian government. And yeah, it all applies equally, right? Like, I won't give the full thing now, but one of our most successful case studies was a mid-sized trucking company. We did some assessments, did all, again, just like the recruiting and retention battalion, it was all focused on culture transformation. In their case, it was geared towards operations and safety. And they saw an 80% reduction in cost of claims and $3 million savings in a single year. So yeah, it applies really, I would say, equally there, a lot of these principles.
That's amazing. Well, Jackson, thanks so much for the time. I'm really grateful. You've accomplished your mission. I feel much happier now than I did before we started. And I wish you all the best. And please let me know when your book comes out so that we can share that as we go out and do our training as well.
Absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you too for the work that you're doing.
Yeah. All the best.
That was good. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Building Better Leaders. If you'd like to learn more about the Doolittle Leadership Center or the leader development workshops we deliver all around the world, please visit us at www.afa.org/DLC. Helping you become a better leader is our passion and our purpose.